So I see we're up to 42.
Good evening, everyone. We'll get underway in just one moment. We're just sharing our stream live to Facebook, and we will get underway in about 1 minute's time as that feed goes live. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Brene Lloyd. I work with Northwatch in Northern Ontario, and we're a colleague organization of Protect Our Waterways, Stop the DGR in South Bruce. And I'm here providing technical support tonight with the webinar hosting. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle Stein from Protect Our Waterways, South Bruce. Michelle.
Good evening. I'm Michelle Stein, and we welcome everybody to this evening's webinar. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Thank you, David and Kevin, for coming to speak this evening. And thank you, Brene, for your help in hosting this webinar. I'll briefly introduce our organization, and then we'll hand it over to our moderator to host this evening's guests. Protect Our Waterways is a not-for-profit group made up of individuals working together to stop the nuclear waste management organization from turning our community into the radioactive waste municipality of Canada. Nobody ever asked us if this was a project we wanted. We are youth who want to protect the outdoors and have dreams of carrying on the family farm. We are young people, young families who chose to live here because they wanted a quiet, safe place to raise their children and enjoy the outdoors. We are people who moved here for their retirement to live in a peaceful, beautiful community and every age in between. Some of us have just recently moved to the area, and others are living on the homestead that the Crown deeded to their family generations ago. We are from every walk of life, all with the common goal of protecting our families, our homes, our water, and our community. Protect Our Waterways is committed to presenting the facts and risks that the NWMO doesn't want to talk about, and we will continue to call on our council and the NWMO to give the community a vote. A binding referendum that gives each resident a voice is the only way to fairly determine willingness. Together, we will work towards protecting our community. Thank you again for joining us this evening.
Thanks very much, Michelle. And just a quick note, we are having some technical difficulties and the panelists' video feed is not operating at this moment. So our apologies for that. We'll now move to our first speaker is David Donnelly. David is an environmental lawyer, extensive experience in environmental law and litigation in Ontario. And David is going to be speaking to us this evening about municipal planning issues. Our evening is going to consist of presentations by Mr. Donnelly and Mr. Camps with a brief opportunity for question and answer after each speaker, and then time for discussion at the end. So I'll just point out in your system, you'll see two different icons at the bottom. A chat function, a chat box, which you can click on and share a message. And we have Diane Wall is acting as our chat master this evening, so she'll be monitoring that chat line. But if you have a question, please post it in the question and answer. That's the icon slightly to the left. And if you click on that, there's an opening for question and answers, and you can post your questions there. We will take a couple of questions that are directly relevant to the presentations after each speaker, and then we'll return for an open session after both speakers have had their time to address other question and answers. So on that note, thank you very much for joining us. And thank you, David. I'll turn the floor over to you. If you would like to begin sharing screen now. Thank you.
Thank you, Brene, very much. I'm just trying to enable my screen here, but it's saying that the host won't let me.
All right, well, we'll go to Plan B, and we'll share your screen from here, David. Is that visible now?
That is excellent. Yes, thank you.
All right, so David, if you'll just give me the clue when to move the slide on, I'll do that from this end. Thank you. Go
I'll
ahead.
do that. Thank you very much, Brene. Hi, my name is David Donnelly. I'm an environmental, municipal, and First Nations lawyer practicing in Toronto. I started as an environmentalist in 1988, and since 2000, we've been working with citizens groups across Canada, working primarily on stopping mega projects such as the Deep Geological Repository. I've been involved in campaigns to put an end to military low-level flight training in Labrador. We worked collaboratively with the Innu Nation in that campaign. We worked with one of my heroes, a woman named Martha Kostek, to try and stop the Old Man River Dam, which was eventually built, but her legal case went all the way to the Supreme Court and changed the way we do federal environmental assessment. So the purpose of my presentation this evening is to try and give a little bit of an overview of a very thin slice of the legal pie that's going to affect the approval of the South Bruce Deep Geological Repository. And that thin slice is the municipal responsibility for the facility. So primarily, this is a federally regulated undertaking because it has a nuclear waste component to it, and we acknowledge that. There are some provincial responsibilities, which I'll touch on very briefly in my presentation. And then on a kind of a false or incorrect reading of the law, the municipality in this case is being excused from having to do almost anything with respect to a formal legal approval that could be appealed. And my presentation tonight is going to be primarily around why I think that's wrong and what I think Protect Our Waterways and you should do to make sure that the municipality is held legally accountable for protecting your rights, your interests, and your environment. So with that, if we could go to the first slide, Brene. Great. So just in terms of Donnelly Law, we've had over 20 years experience in practicing law, represented over 300 citizens groups, and I've won lots of awards. That's probably just as boring to you as it is to me now. So next slide, please. So just to set the context of this, we do have some experience fighting nuclear repositories in Ontario. In 2015, we were retained by a group called Save Our Saugeen Shores, your neighbors. They were opposed to the NWMO, or the Nuclear Waste Management Organizations, what I call NWMOs, plan to locate a deep geological repository for low and intermediate level nuclear waste next to the Bruce power plant in Kincardine. If we could go to the next slide. Great. On May the 6th, 2015, the Ministry of the Environment, Federal publicly released the Joint Review Panel's report. Now, this gave conditional acceptance to the DGR. The SOS retained us. We filed a judicial review asking the federal court to review this conditional acceptance or approval. Shortly thereafter, the court case was suspended because the minister put a pause or a freeze on the approval and in fact asked for more study. That was 5 years ago, and we have not heard a single thing from the federal government or the proponent with respect to that project since then. And of course, there was the intervening matter of the Saugeen First Nation. So all that to say that we've been around this block before, and we know a little bit about NWMO and the process. Now, with respect to the process, there are a couple of very interesting steps that I'd like to draw your attention to, because I think they're highly relevant to what you should be doing or considering in terms of challenging the municipality's role in this so-called approval. Now, we've been through the 3 steps so far, which is to initiate the siting process, to provide the community with an opportunity to define their interest, whether that's been done or not. I'll leave that to others. Step 3, which was given a successful complete initial screening. We conducted a preliminary assessment of potential suitability. That's been done. So if we can move to the next slide, we're really now into steps 4 and 5 in the process. Now, step 4, and this is an important one, the NWMO advertises to host communities that they will conduct detailed site evaluations. They're to be completed at the site identified as having strong potential to meet project requirements in the step 3 preliminary assessments. So what's being advertised here is that you should have great confidence in this site selection process because experts, technical experts, most or all of whom have a long history with the nuclear industry, have provided or will provide detailed site evaluations. And that's fine. That's a normal part of the process. That's to be expected. What's unusual in this case, what's inappropriate in this case, what's wrong in this case, what's perverse in this case, is that there has been no mechanism detailed to permit peer review. Peer review being the absolutely mandatory component of any site evaluation process if it's to be deemed independent and fair. And what I'm going to get into in a moment is discussion of how that should be performed, that peer review, and how it should be funded. The second big issue that I take with the NWMO process, which I think could lead to some legal consequences, is the fact that it is a step in the process that NWMO must obtain acceptance to the host repository is confirmed. In other words, that South Bruce is a quote unquote willing host community. Well, of course, the big question there is, how is that to be determined? Is it to be determined by your municipal council who weren't elected on platforms of being a host to a nuclear waste repository in a prime agricultural area? That would be ridiculous. And yet so far, the calls for a binding referendum have not borne fruit. The council is not discussing the nature of a possible future referendum. And I'm going to get into a little bit of detail on why I think that's wrong and how it should be corrected. If we go to the next slide, please. So the willing host. This is a very important detail in the acceptance or the approval process that both the federal government, the NWMO, and your municipal council of South Bruce are all advertising or all really selling as one of the major approval components. Now, I have never been involved in a major facility siting process where people advertise a willing host and they don't say that there'll be some form of a referendum or a plebiscite. Now, the NWMO has said in their principles document, acceptance will need to be supported by compelling demonstration of willingness. But my question is, well, what does that mean? Does that mean a binding referendum? If it's not a referendum, it's something else. For example, a non-binding referendum, where you would all come out and some snowy night, everybody would vote. There would be an overwhelming majority one way or the other. Is your council really saying that they would reject that referendum, that the will of the people was not sufficient for them, and that a small group of people could get into a room and that they could say that they would overturn the results of the referendum? Well, what I'm saying is that if that happened, there would be a legal challenge, particularly to the jurisdiction of the municipality to make that decision. Now, I'm sure someone's going to have a question like, well, what would that legal challenge look like? What are the precedents? What are the cases? And I have to remind people of the Fight Rule Club, which is the first rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about the Fight Club. In this particular case, I would think that a municipal council overturning a referendum, I can tell you that it's my opinion that that would lead to significant legal consequences. Now, there's one other condition that is put into the principles of this approval, and that's the right to withdraw. It is being advertised that communities that decide to engage in the process for listing a site as potential host must have a right to end their involvement in the siting process at any point up to and until the final agreement is signed. And so that provides a very interesting point or hook that you need to engage the South Bruce Township Council. And that point is this: nobody on that council got elected on a platform for approving this development. In other words, it would be unfair, it would be categorically wrong to sign anything, including a final agreement, anything that binds the community until there's been another municipal election. In other words, the people can have their say in terms of who are the people that will be entering into these agreements, first which will be staged. And so what I'm saying is that before there's any decision on this, there should be a municipal election and there should be a binding referendum. But that right to withdraw is an important right that you have. Next slide, please. Now, the evaluation and the peer review process. Now, in terms of the opinion of the registered professional planner the POW has retained, his name is Alan Ramsey. He has over 30 years experience in land use planning. And he and I agree that there are some fundamental principles around these peer reviews that are critical. The peer reviews are a critically important aspect of any major planning study or significant undertaking such as the NWO site selection process. These peer reviews provide an opportunity to evaluate the work of one or more people with similar competencies as the producers of the work, that's the peers, and are used to maintain quality standards and improve performance. Peer reviews function as a form of self-regulation by qualified members of the profession within the relevant field. In other words, it's a check on the system. Most importantly, it's an important tool to make sure that the fox isn't guarding the chicken coop. What I mean by that is many of the professionals that are being retained in this situation or will be retained will have a close association with the nuclear industry and its regulation. The importance of peer review can't be emphasized enough, and that is to say, the municipality must either bring in of its own volition and most particularly assist citizens in retaining experts who are independent from the nuclear industry to provide that critical scientific peer review step. Now, it's widely acknowledged that the Township of South Group does not have the staff or financial resources to undertake peer review of these NWNO reports. Many of them are going to be quite technical. Nor does the township have financial resources to retain experts to conduct peer reviews. Go to the next slide, please. The solution that we're proposing is that the South Bruce Township adopt a model called intervenor funding that is used in municipalities throughout Ontario. Funding peer reviews is normally provided by the proponent of major planning or significant undertakings. In many jurisdictions, most jurisdictions in which I work, funding of peer review is a requirement of a Planning Act application. In such places as Windsor, London, Burlington, Oakville, Vaughan, Toronto, Pickering, almost any municipality you can name. Now, it's my primary recommendation that the Township of South Bruce must update its fees bylaw to require a cost recovery for peer review as part of any future Planning Act application, and approach the NWO to request that NWO provide the municipality with funding for peer reviews. I would think that a failure to obtain peer review funding from the MWO would be a critical failure on the part of the South Bruce Township, and that would give rise to, in my opinion, a challenge in terms of the fundamental fairness of the process, that is, the independence of the reviews of these studies. Now, another point is that should the township refuse to be a willing host community, that the township should refuse to be a willing host community if the NWO declines to fund the peer review work, which includes the peer review work of the concerned residents. In other words, it's quite possible that this council is either in favor of this proposal or they're beholden to the NWMO through all manner of funding agreements and sponsoring all sorts of things and providing funding arrangements. The only way that this process can be deemed to be truly fair is to fund the peer review work of the community, and that means you and that means the POW. And again, if the township refuses to provide this intervenor funding, then it's my submission that the township should be denied the ability to declare itself a willing host. In other words, this is a disqualifying position. Look at the next slide, please. Okay. Now, I'm going to give a very light touch to the legal opinion here with respect to the approvals and the appeals, simply because it's a public forum and there are most likely people on the line here who are directly tied to MWMO. The critical matter here is how much power or authority does the municipality have with respect to approving this facility? And the answer, in my opinion, is very, very clear. This is agricultural land. This does not have an industrial designation. There is no more right on the part of the NWO, which is a private corporation, than there is of any other person, whether it be a farmer, a business person, or anyone else, to put up outbuildings, accessory buildings, truck washing stations, laundry facilities, anything that is extraneous to the core operation of a federally regulated facility, whether it's a nuclear waste disposal site or an airport. Now, the South Bruce zoning bylaw 2011-63 does not authorize a nuclear waste repository. That's very clear. The bylaw does permit certain services or utilities that are referenced in section 3.1.1 of the bylaw. However, the repository isn't included. The bylaw goes on to read that in terms of the provision of public uses, buildings, and or structures, anything despite section 3.1, any building or structure designed as use as an office or storage or other uses must conform to the provisions of this bylaw. In other words, anything that's put up there must be approved by the municipality. That means that the municipality must require of the proponent to make certain Planning Act applications. Those planning applications must be debated at municipal council. That debate must include a mandatory statutory public meeting. The results of those public meeting must be presented at council. Council must take a recorded vote, and that recorded vote is then subject to an appeal under the Planning Act and the Local Planning Act, Local Planning Appeal Tribunal Act. In other words, the municipality cannot and should not have the final say on the land use planning or the approval of this facility. If the municipality proceeds without requiring or obtaining these approvals, that creates a legal jeopardy, and there has been an opinion shared with POW with respect to the action that should be taken. If we go to the next slide, please. Good. Now, in terms of the public authority and the uses, what this means is that in layman's terms, the NWMO should apply under the Planning Act for amendments to the South Bruce zoning bylaw, just like anybody else should in the municipality, whether you're a farmer, you're a business person, or anyone else. And I think that this is a very powerful tool that can be used to make sure that the public are fully engaged. The problem that I have with the process that your council is using presently is that they are in effect writing themselves a minister's zoning order, or an MZO, that exempts the NWMO from jumping through the normal planning hoops that any other business would have to if they were proposing to locate in South Bruce. Now, MZOs are extremely controversial. If you read the Toronto Star, you've seen that they've been featuring a number of MZOs that have been issued all across the GTA. The most famous or infamous being the MZO issued in Pickering, which is the subject of a feature in the Toronto Star, where there's a proposal to affect provincially significant wetlands to allow for an entertainment center. Well, MZOs are not subject to appeal. They are not part of a public process. They are to be used only in extraordinary circumstances. What's odd in this case is your council hasn't even asked for an MZO. It's proceeding as if the Planning Act doesn't exist. And what I'm saying is that is very problematic legally. We can have the next slide. So the big question is, well, can you fight City Hall and can you win? Well, I'm pleased to say that our firm represents a group called Get Stratford in Stratford, Ontario, better known as Festival City. That council secretly asked the Ford government for a minister's zoning order, and they obtained one in December of 2020. Now, this is a proposal for a 1 million square foot, that should be $400 million float glass plant that is proposed for agricultural land on the outskirts of Stratford. On January the 13th, the city of, after a campaign by local residents, after an outcry, there are people that are holding vigils on the steps of City Hall. There is a campaign to force Gigny to admit to its greenhouse gas emissions, which they simply will not divulge. The estimate is that Gigny will be emitting 2 to 3 times the amount of greenhouse gas that the entire city of Stratford presently emits. Well, on January the 13th, 2021, the mayor announced that the city of Stratford would be putting their project evaluation on hiatus, and that they will be seeking input from the public on a evaluation and public consultation plan, and that is if they consider the project still to be viable. So the first takeaway from the example from Stratford is that the province claims it will only issue MZOs after a municipality asks for such a land use approval. In other words, your council should be taking steps to secure Planning Act approval from Gigny, and that they should not be granting themselves an MZO, because the province will only issue MZOs if they're requested by a municipality, and this municipality should not do so now. If we can go to the last slide, please. Finally, Milton and Campbellville. This is a quarry that is going into, proposed to be going into the Greenbelt. It's near the Niagara Escarpment. The citizens of Milton were opposed to the Campbellville quarry. Doug Ford went to Milton to make an announcement about schools. He was asked about the quarry, and he said, I quote, "I'm not in favor of the Campbellville quarry. I believe in governing for the people. When the people don't want something, you don't do it. It's very simple. I know the mayor doesn't want it. No one wants it. I don't want it. We're going to make sure it doesn't happen one way or another." In other words, David can beat Goliath. If you can bring a similar pressure to bear, and I know you can, this is an incredibly competent group. Bill Knoll and his group are an excellent group of organizers. You're well on your way based on some of the polling that I've seen to secure public support. I think that if the people of Milton could convince the premier to be against the quarry, you can easily convince this government, your residents, and your council, whether it's this council or newly elected council. I'm sure you can convince them that this is a bad idea, both from an ethical standpoint, but also in terms of land use planning. And lastly, and certainly not leastly, it's a bad idea legally. Thank you. That's my presentation.
Great, and thank you very much, David. If our panelists could try and turn on their cameras now, I think they should be available in the system. There we are. That was excellent, David. And we've got a couple of minutes. We're going to take we've got some question and answers building up there in our in the system. So we'll try to run through a few of those because they are quite specific to your topic, David. So we'll take a couple of them now. Pat Gibbons asked, what is the requirement that real estate listings, listing docs include a disclosure for the DGR if South Bruce is selected, and how would that affect property value? So maybe that's more a question. We'll hold the property value question for Kevin. But David, I wonder if you can tell us if there's any requirement for disclosure in real estate listings for a project such as this.
Well, that's a very interesting question. Again, Kevin may have more experience than I do with respect to the nuclear facilities. Typically what happens is that you have to list anything that could affect the value of their property. It's usually specific to something that is happening on your property. But I think it would be a very interesting case if someone did list their home for sale, didn't advise that there was a high-level radioactive waste being proposed for their residents. The person bought it, their property values fell. I could certainly see litigation resulting, but again, Kevin probably knows more about that than I do.
Great, thanks very much. And a question, what areas of planning concerns should be addressed in the NWMO socioeconomic impact study? And should the local community know enough to raise these concerns?
Well, that's an excellent question. So the problem that I'm having with the process as it's structured so far is that an excellent example of a study that should be conducted, the impact should be assessed, there should be peer review, but then there should be a decision made by someone other than council. Council's not constituted, doesn't have the expertise to make a decision such as this. That's why we have appeal rights in the province of Ontario in terms of what are the impacts, what's the scope of work that should be undertaken, what sort of things should be analyzed. The problem that I'm having with the process so far is that it never funnels down to an actual decision that's appealable. It's like the municipality is trying to control the process, and yet at the same time, they're admitting that they don't have the expertise, the technical expertise, whether amongst themselves or in-house, to actually deal with these issues. So whether it's noise, air quality, fugitive emissions, agrology, hydrogeology, cultural heritage landscapes. There are a number of technical disciplines that are engaged by all this that should be evaluated under the Planning Act, but aren't. And so the question's an excellent one, but I think at the end of the day, it sort of really doesn't matter, because until we get a process that's fair, it's just really going to be the NWMO talking to the municipal council. And that's not right in my mind.
Right. Thanks very much, David. One last question before we move on to our second speaker. The question is, beside the scale of this project alone, should there be planning concerns regarding ancillary industries that come about as a result of this project?
Right, that's an excellent question. So it would be extremely naive to think that this facility, it's a huge facility, it's got lots of, there will be ancillary businesses and services that will be needed, laundry just being a very simple one. And of course, you're going to have to build facilities and businesses to cater to or to service this industry. So in the normal course, what would happen is there would be a public consultation around official plan, a new official plan or an official plan amendment that would use the DGR as a kind of a centerpiece for a whole industrial commercial build out or expansion, and that there would be a debate and the impact would be discussed, and people would have a chance to tell their council whether they thought that the principle of the change of land use was a good idea. Do you really want this amount of industry and these kinds of businesses coming to your community? This, in my mind, is backwards planning, where you look at the facility, you say yes to it, there's no vote, there's no opportunity for public consultation, and then you get all these businesses coming to town, and you deal with those piecemeal, one at a time on a one-off basis, and you may or may not have a planning act right then, but by that time, the cat is already out of the bag, and you're stuck with this giant industry. And then say, in a nightmare scenario, these ancillary businesses don't get approved. Now you're going to have to truck in all these services from all over the place, and the whole thing is even more chaotic than when you started.
Right. Great. Thank you very much, David. Excellent presentation and responses, and lots of food for thought there. We're going to move on. We will have time at the end to come back for a general question period. So if you have some additional questions for David, take note, and we'll come back for a general discussion at the end. But now we're going to move to our next speaker, Kevin Camps. Kevin Camps is a nuclear waste watchdog. He is a long-term researcher, advocate, intervener on nuclear waste matters at the local, state, national, and international level. And we're very fortunate to have Kevin here as a speaker tonight. And Kevin is going to speak about radioactive stigma. So thank you, Kevin. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Bernane. It's a real honor and privilege to be invited by Northwatch and Protect Our Waterways to speak tonight. And I just wanted to, by way of background, literally, I had a car breakdown on the way home. So I'm actually at a Toyota dealership, and the quietest place I found in the lounge is the children's room. So I don't know if you can see off to this side, the kids have decorated the walls with chalk art. And so it's kind of fun to be in here. But the faint music in the background, I apologize for. So again, my name is Kevin Camps, and my title is Radioactive Waste Specialist at Beyond Nuclear in Tacoma Park, Maryland, which is a nuclear-free zone neighboring Washington, D.C. And I've worked at Beyond Nuclear since 2007. Before that, I worked at Nuclear Information and Resource Service in Washington, D.C. as a nuclear waste specialist beginning in 1999. I'm also on the board of directors of Don't Waste Michigan, which is the statewide anti-nuclear group in the Great Lakes state. And I'm on the advisory board of Citizens for Alternatives to Chemical Contamination, which is a statewide environmental watchdog in Michigan. And part of the reason I named all the groups I'm affiliated with is one of my honors, something I'm really proud about, is thanks to colleagues in Michigan alerting me and the world on the American side of the border anyway, way back to my memory in 2001, but it might have been 2002, we knew from the very beginning about the deep geologic repository targeted at Kincardine for so-called low and intermediate level radioactive waste from across Ontario, or as Dave Martin at Greenpeace used to call it, the DUD instead of DGR, the deep underground dump. So a 20-year battle, hats off to the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation for hammering the final nail into that coffin. But the reason we're here tonight, these fights go on. So on the American side of the border, we've experienced so many of these fights over the decades. One of my main areas of focus since 1992 really has been the Yucca Mountain high-level radioactive waste dump proposed in Nevada on Western Shoshone Indian land. And in fact, later in my time, I will talk a bit about the state of Nevada Agency for Nuclear Projects, which has done a lot of groundbreaking work on radioactive stigma economic effects. Even if nothing goes wrong, decreases in property values, and then significant economic impacts if something does go wrong in terms of a large-scale radioactivity release. And another area of focus for me for a long time has been what used to be called monitored retrievable storage sites, and they've changed the name over the years. It's now called centralized or consolidated interim storage facilities. And they used to target Native American reservations in the United States. There were two really extended fights, one at Mescalero Apache in New Mexico, another at Skull Valley Goshoots in Utah. And I really liked David's conclusion of his slideshow that David can defeat Goliath, because these have been David versus Goliath fights. I mean, the Yucca Mountain dump in Nevada, at last estimate by the US Department of Energy, was a $100 billion, give or take, proposal. And although each of these consolidated interim storage facilities are smaller in size, it's still very much David versus Goliath. And yet we have won all these fights thus far. But as we speak, they are trying to open consolidated interim storage facilities in New Mexico and Texas, not directly on Native American reservations this time in Hispanic, Latinx areas of the borderlands between those two states, but certainly the indigenous peoples of those places and beyond have ties to those lands that were taken from them. So these fights go on, and it's like a game of whack-a-mole. When they don't get away with it in one place, they set up shop in another place. And oftentimes they're targeting low-income people of color communities in the United States. So that's a big part of this fight, the environmental injustice of it all. So to get into the radioactive stigma effect, as it's called, I took a big crash course in this when I was asked by a group called Families Against Radiation Exposure in Port Hope, Ontario, to present about our experience in the United States along these lines. So I'm thankful to you for inviting me tonight, a refresher course, because this was back in late 2011 that I was invited up to Port Hope to testify before the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. It was about a license extension at Cameco's uranium conversion facility in Port Hope. And the title of my talk was Worsening Radioactive Stigma. And so in summary, it just looked at the history of radioactive and toxic and nuclear activities in Port Hope dating back to the 1930s, even before the Manhattan Project, when it was a radium processing center. And the contamination that then hemorrhaged into that community, as lovely as it is, considered one of the prettiest places in Ontario in terms of a small town, in terms of the architecture and such, and the history. But unfortunately, radioactive contaminated landfill materials from the El Dorado radium facility were used to build foundations of elementary schools in that town with unknown health impacts on generations of children. And with the ongoing Cameco operations in that town, and this was a license extension proceeding, which would add to the contamination that's been released from the facilities. Some of the testimony at that CNSC proceeding were by local folks who were talking about the differential between property values in Port Hope and Cobourg, just down the Lake Ontario shoreline. And one moment from the hearing I just wanted to share because it was so remarkable was, you know how these companies will give charitable donations to local organizations to win favor. And in Port Hope, Cameco had donated towards a number of groups. One of them was the Cobourg Waterfront Festival. So the Cobourg Waterfront Festival gave a talk, a short presentation before the CNSC, and thanked Cameco for the donation and, you know, talked about its event, its annual event that sounded really great. And one of the CNSC commissioners during the question and answer period asked, if Cobourg has a waterfront festival, what about Port Hope? And there was an audible gasp in the room, followed by nervous laughter. And a part of the reason that Port Hope doesn't have a waterfront festival is that the chemical facility is really immediately upon the lakeshore. So it's taking up a lot of Port Hope's lakeshore. But there's also that less talked about contamination issue. So the 30-pager that I did for that expert testimony back in 2011 in Port Hope defined stigma. I just used the Random House Dictionary definition of a mark of disgrace or infamy, a stain or reproach, as on one's reputation. There's also medical definitions, a mental or physical mark that is characteristic of a defect or disease. And there's also the definition from Christianity with the word stigmata. And my testimony owed a huge debt of gratitude to Dr. Alan Marshall of Masaryk University in the Czech Republic. His study entitled Social Equity in Nuclear Waste Management, dated 2005, was remarkable in its depth and breadth. And yet again, I mentioned Nevada because they've been fighting the Yucca Mountain dump out there really since the early 1980s, but especially since 1987, when it was singled out for the high-level radioactive waste dump in the United States. And so many of his references referred back to these Nevada studies by the likes of Slovic, Lehman, and Flynn. One of their studies was entitled Perceived Risk, Trust, and Nuclear Waste, Lessons from Yucca Mountain. And the areas that Nevada has focused on because of the nature of their economy out there include areas like tourism, business investments, retirement decisions, job creation, and property values. And again, like I said before, they made the strong point that just the unfolding of the Yucca Mountain project in that state near Las Vegas, just 100 miles or less from Las Vegas, especially in terms of the transportation of the waste through Las Vegas, had property value impacts, decreased property values without anything going wrong, without ground even having been broken at Yucca Mountain. And this also happened in New Mexico at another nuclear waste repository. This is called the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, which is a military plutonium waste dump that's been operational since 1999, had a radioactive release to the environment in 2014 that was supposed to have been impossible. And workers did inhale alpha particles, which is an ultra hazard to their lungs and a high risk of lung cancer in the future. But way back in 1992, so 7 years before WIP went operational, Santa Fe, New Mexico, the state capital, designated a bypass route for the shipments, especially those from Los Alamos National Laboratory, to bypass Santa Fe instead of going right through it. And a family owning land along that bypass route, once it was designated, they actually sued for recovery of lost property values. This was back in 1992, and they won in court. a jury decision that was backed up on appeal. Hundreds of thousands of dollars awarded to this family for loss of property value adjacent to this waste transportation route long before the facility even opened, long before the first shipment ever came through. There was a negative impact on their property values. So I wanted to mention another study that was cited in this Marshall work, and that was one by Dunlap, Kraft, and Rosa, public reactions to nuclear waste, dated 1993. And there was a quote in there that radioactive is the top neighbor from hell. That's a quote. They compared it to other hazardous and polluting industries, and it turned out that public perceptions of nuclear facilities and radioactive waste in particular are very significant. Another issue that Marshall raised in his sociological study was the issue of nuclear oases. And I wanted to bring this up tonight because of the presence of Bruce Nuclear Generating Station in your area. As the nuclear industry begins to contract ever more rapidly in many places in the world, there are still those places like Bruce Nuclear that are going forward. And it's at those locations that the nuclear industry looks to establish itself in such things as radioactive waste dumps. And we're certainly seeing that in New Mexico in the United States. Los Alamos began in 1943 as a part of the Manhattan Project. And now New Mexico hosts many aspects of the nuclear industry, from uranium mining all the way through this proposal by a company called Holtec International to establish a high-level radioactive waste consolidated interim storage facility for all of America's commercial wastes. And the risk there will be that it will become a de facto permanent surface storage facility for our lack of a permanent repository in this country. And New Mexico is a majority minority state. That means that the indigenous and Latino population of New Mexico is a majority. So there's that element too. A part of why New Mexico has been targeted since the 1940s for these facilities that other states don't want or would not accept is because of their demographics, the color of the people who live there, and their economic status and lack of political power related to it. There was a quote in Marshall that I wanted to get out there because it really speaks to New Mexico and Nevada, which have no atomic reactors in their states, and yet they are targeted for these dumps again and again. The same with Native American reservations. So Marshall wrote that, and NIMBY refers to not in my backyard. He wrote, although NIMBYism is denounced by many project planners as the irrational knee-jerk reaction of technically unsophisticated locals acting out of self-interest, if we trust the research outlined in my study, it seems as though the quick and indiscriminate label of NIMBYism is but the knee-jerk reaction of politically unsophisticated project planners who themselves are reacting under self-interest. And that's sure been a part of our success in stopping these dumps in the United States. This decide, announce, defend approach to these dumps. There is talk these days of consent-based siting. They don't have it in New Mexico. They don't have it in Texas. They don't have it in Nevada. So that really gets us some traction with the public in our fights. I'll close because I'm coming up on my 20 minutes here, just talking about a major piece of work by the state of Nevada from February 2002. It was their comments on the draft environmental impact statement by the Department of Energy for the Yucca Mountain high-level radioactive waste dump. They titled it "A Mountain of Trouble, a Nation at Risk," a report on the impacts of the proposed Yucca Mountain high-level nuclear waste dump program. And they relied on studies, like I mentioned before, that went back easily to the 1990s, even to the 1980s, about radioactive stigma, its socioeconomic impacts, the need for assessment of those impacts on Nevada's principal economic sectors. So that is a treasure trove of information. Another area of Nevada's groundbreaking work would include the risks of high-level radioactive waste transportation. One of the slogans down here is, when it comes to high-level radioactive waste transportation, we all live in Nevada. The same applies to New Mexico, the same applies to Texas. To get the waste, which is predominantly east of the Mississippi River, 75% of the reactors in the waste is east of the Mississippi. 90% is in the eastern half of the United States. To get it out west to these targeted dump sites means passing through most states in the lower 48. And there are radioactive stigma impacts, whether it's by road, by rail, or by waterway, along those transportation routes. And again, the environmental justice issue of who lives along these transportation routes is important. And the very last thing I wanted to mention is that Hanford, Washington, and Deaf Smith County, Texas, in the past were targeted for high-level radioactive waste dumps. They got off of that targeting list when Yucca Mountain was singled out. But in both of their cases, agricultural interests were important and came to the fore in the fight against those dumps. The same can be said of New Mexico and Texas now in these fights against consolidated interim storage. Agriculture is big in those areas, and so is oil and gas. The Permian Basin on either side of the Texas-New Mexico border is the most active oil and gas fields in the world at this point, outperforming Saudi Arabia even. So that's another aspect of all this, is the impacts on other industries, on other economic sectors, in addition to property value loss. And I think that's pretty much my presentation.
Great, thank you very much, Kevin. That was an excellent presentation, and again, lots of information for us to take in and to consider in the context of South Bruce and the struggles in South Bruce right now. I'm going to start. We've got lots of questions queued up in the Q&A. I'm going to start with a couple of questions which are specific. I think we've got 3 questions so far that are very specific to Kevin's presentations. We've got a couple that are general and a couple that we'll go back to David with. So we'll start, Kevin, I'm going to ask you to go back to the question that was asked earlier about how this deep geological repository, if it ever came into effect, or even the threat of it coming into effect, how could that affect property values?
Right. All those examples I gave seem to have the same result, and that was that just the unfolding of the project, the proposing of the scheme, began to have property value impacts. Certainly if the facilities get built and operate like in Port Hope over many decades, that contributes more to property value loss. And it has to do with very real issues like radioactive and toxic chemical contamination, leaving the facility, polluting the local environment. And that's if, accidents don't happen. If catastrophes happen, and the biggest yet thus far include Chernobyl and Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, then the property value losses are even more significant, of course, because the pollution levels are dramatically greater. And another part of Marshall's study was the cover-up of information, the battle for the truth that's so essential to a lot of our anti-nuclear struggles. So that would explain a lot of the attempts to put a lid on the truth. And I'll just point to 3 Mile Island. Officially, it's regarded as an accident that had very few consequences. But talk to the thousands of families that were part of class action lawsuits. Settlements were reached out of court, and non-disclosure agreements were signed, which means the families will lose the revenue if they ever talk about their stories. And so they've gotten away with a lot of cover-up at 3 Mile Island. We've done entire newsletters on anniversaries of the meltdown in 1979. So the one thing I would emphasize too, in addition to the facility itself being targeted at South Bruce, is that transportation issue. Because what it means is you've got a lot of allies over a vast region, because these shipments, whether by truck or train or barge, are going to be passing through countless communities. And again, even if everything goes smoothly, there are property value impacts along those transport routes. And then if anything were to happen untoward and radioactivity is released, then those impacts are much more significant.
Great, thank you. We've got a question, I think, also around stigma, but pretty close to home for South Bruce. How would nuclear stigma affect farm product sales if the DGR was sited in an agricultural community? Have you touched on that at all in your work to date, Kevin?
Well, I'm reminded of some letters that the governor of New Mexico, who's a top Biden ally, she was on his transition team directorship, fired off to the energy secretary in the US, to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission chairman, to former President Trump, where she referred to nuclear waste storage in New Mexico as economic malpractice. And she was speaking directly to agricultural industries in New Mexico, including cattle ranching, pecans, and various other agricultural sectors, which are in the billions of dollars in New Mexico, one of the biggest money makers in the whole state. And certainly a dramatic example of this would be Fukushima again, where the Fukushima fisheries and all agricultural sectors have suffered catastrophically from the stigma. And there is attempts to try to claim that tests are done, that the food stuffs are not contaminated above regulatory permissible levels, but then things will happen and there will be outliers. And you can just see it in other countries' attitude towards Fukushima fisheries, for example. Entire countries no longer importing Fukushima fisheries, where it was a major import in places like South Korea before. So, you know, it depends on the details, but there are major impacts to agricultural sectors.
Okay, great, thanks. We've got a question around property values. It's a bit of a challenge question. If there is a concern with decreased land values in the vicinity of nuclear facilities, how do you explain the fact that real estate values in Port Elgin and Kincardine are some of the highest in Bruce County, with Ontario's largest nuclear plant situated there?
Well, I imagine I haven't studied the details of the Bruce Nuclear Generating Station in terms of their municipal revenues, but I assume that they are significant, as they are in the United States around nuclear power plants, which buys services in the local area, including schools. So that is going to prop up real estate values. The downside is, and we're facing this more and more in the United States, when these nuclear power plants close, it is a dramatic impact on those local municipalities. Those revenue streams stop entirely, and these monocultures, so to speak, are in real trouble economically. So an example would be the Zion nuclear power plant, 30 miles north of Chicago. 2 large-scale reactors, 1,000 megawatts electric each, closed after just 25 years of operations in 1998. And long story short, Zion is hurting. It is in economic trouble. Part of that is that they can't redevelop the lakeshore because the high-level radioactive waste is still there, even though the decommissioning is supposedly done. Because of our lax decommissioning rules in this country, lingering radioactive contamination is a real issue. So you got to look towards that too, that there is a downside once the revenue streams stop.
Great, thank you, Kevin. One last question on the radioactive stigma, and then we'll move to more general questions, and we'll maybe start with a couple that are directed to David. So a last question on stigma that we have posted so far. Do you think stigmatization played a role in the cancellation of low to intermediate level waste shipments in the Great Lakes as proposed by Bruce Power and approved by the federal government? So this would be, I think you're familiar with this, Kevin, the steam generator shipment that was proposed a number of years ago from Bruce to Sweden. So the question is, do you think STIGMA played any kind of a role in that cancellation?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there was quite a groundswell of resistance all along the way. And I don't just mean in the US and Canada, but even overseas in the UK and other countries in Europe along these transportation routes. And certainly a part of it was the concern about the potential for accidents. And that had reverberations in those communities. And so a lot of the focus was on the accident potential, the safety and environmental aspects of that, the health aspects of that. In places like Detroit, Windsor, where the narrow Detroit River, studies were done by the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative. They had excellent technical expertise to look at what would happen if one of these shipments went down in the Detroit River. And what if even a very small fraction of the contents were to leak out? And once those studies were published, we got a lot of traction with those municipalities to oppose. So there's the economic aspects of that, and then there's also the environmental and the health and the safety. But I'd say yes, it was significant.
Great, good, thank you. Thanks very much, Kevin. And thanks for all those excellent questions and your very generous responses, Kevin. We're going to move to a more open discussion period, which we're going to start by going to some questions that were posed directly to David. And then we've got some general questions which can go to David or Kevin, or David and Kevin. The first question directed to David is, the South Bruce Municipal Council, by way of previous resolutions, has defined this municipality as not a willing host in regards to hosting wind farms. These resolutions were done without public input or referendum. In having done so in the past, does this not give them legal precedent to do so again in deciding whether or not South Bruce is a willing host to this DGR? David, can you comment on that?
Well, so the answer to that is yes. This municipal council can do whatever it wants, no matter how immoral, unethical, undemocratic. And that, I think, is the spirit of my presentation, which is this process is untethered to any sort of legal process. These are rules cooked up between the NWMO and your municipal council. And I think that basically everything that's occurred so far is illegitimate because it's been essentially a kind of an old boys club working together to come up with all these crazy rules. I mean, how can you possibly establish the determination of a willing host community unless you poll the voters? I mean, what other way is there to do it? So I am shocked that your council would declare your municipality an unwilling host for wind turbines by simply passing a resolution of council. I think that's fundamentally undemocratic. And I think any demonstration of willingness that doesn't include a binding referendum is frankly illegitimate and subject to legal challenge. Bernane, can I also make a point about the property values? Because I do have a little bit of experience with this in Pickering, Ontario, where the Pickering nuclear power plant is located. So, so look, there are townhouses very close by the Pickering nuclear power plant. And they're of some value. The question is not whether does Port Elgin, Kincardine, or Pickering have high or reasonably high property values in proximity to a nuclear power plant. The question is, properly put, what is the property value with versus without a nuclear power plant? So, Kincardine and Port Elgin are, valuable properties because they're on the water. It's the same thing in Pickering. But I can guarantee you when they take away the nuclear power plant in Pickering, which hopefully they'll do very soon, those property values will escalate dramatically. The second thing is, do your research. I mean, I hate to raise this. I was commissioned to I was counsel to a coalition, the Safe Drinking Water Coalition, the Washington Commission of Inquiry Phase 2. I tried to do a Google search just while while Kevin was talking, and I couldn't find anything on decrease in property values in Walkerton, Ontario, post-tragedy. So, if property values aren't a big issue, then why isn't there a study? Believe me, if it wasn't an issue, there would be a study out there. They'd be waving in your face and they'd tell you to stop being so hysterical. I'm telling you, lost property values is one of those things that people don't talk about because it's so obvious. And again, just ask yourself the question, Kincardine, Port Elgin, or Pickering, with or without a nuclear power plant, what happens to the property values? It's obvious, the answer.
Right. Thanks very much, David. And we're getting a number of comments in the chat making very similar points about Port Elgin and Kincardine are both on Lake Huron. They're on the shore, and some challenges as to whether the statements about real estate on the rise relative to other prices also in the chat. We have another question, David, that was posed directly to you, although it's a general question that I think maybe we'll ask Kevin, offer Kevin an opportunity to comment on as well. The question is, if South Bruce says no to the DGR, then is there any hope that the area, it's called the Ignis area, but the site is between Ignis and Dryden, the area in Treaty 3 could also say no? Or will the NWMO just continue to, the questioner asks, will NWMO just continue to buy everyone's acceptance? By the way, NWMO has already spent millions of dollars. Any comment on that? First, I'll go to David. That's who the question was posed to, but also invite if Kevin would like to comment.
Well, it's an excellent question, and it does raise some problems around equity. I have no doubt the Ignis community is not as well resourced as the South Bruce community, but I also similarly have no doubt that the South Bruce community isn't as well resourced as Kincardine, Pickering, or the Darlington, Oshawa community. So I think it is a terrible tragedy that what we have here is a process where this company is going around offering municipalities money for all sorts of things, not just studies, but also public amenities, supporting community, groups and foundations and so on and so forth. I mean, it looks to me in many respects like it's bribery, but that's just my opinion. What really should happen here is there should be some form of commission that goes out and studies the problem and, is independent and comes to a determination about what the rules are around a willing host community. They should set real rules, real guidelines. There should be equal funding. It should be conducted, frankly, as it would be under the Environmental Assessment Act, with real rules, intervenor funding, a result, an appeal, a right to challenge in court. I mean, that's the way we do things sensibly. Look, if this was a garbage dump, for crying out loud, garbage dumps rarely kill people, okay? If this was a garbage dump, we would be under all those rules that I just listed. But because it's high-level radioactive nuclear waste that's going to be around forever, we've come up with a process that looks to me like it was written on the back of a napkin, is untraceable and unappealable. This is ridiculous. This is a ridiculous process.
Thank you, David. I'm going to offer Kevin the chance to comment on that as well. And then I have a question directed to Kevin. Kevin, did you want to add anything on this?
Yeah, I remember a book that's in the Library of Nuclear Information and Resource Service in Washington, D.C. It's entitled A Poison Stronger Than Love, about the Grassy Narrows First Nation. It's about the alcoholism on the reservation. And that's what's so unjust and wrong about targeting Ojibwe country again and again in Canada, but also, dozens of Native American reservations in the United States. I mean, I'm reminded of a quote from Keith Lewis at Serpent River First Nation. He was their environmental director. He said, "There is nothing moral about tempting a starving man with money." He was talking about the uranium mining at Elliott Lake and the suffering that the Serpent River First Nation has endured for decades since those mines just went bust. So Yeah, the environmental injustice of these proposals are objectionable on their face, and that's why I'm so inspired by what Saugeen Ojibwe Nation did up your way.
Right, thank you. And our next question is directed to you, Kevin, and it's around social division. And you're asked to comment. Could Kevin comment to the division that's occurring within both South Bruce and in the Ignis area, as lines are being drawn between those for the DGR, those against, those who claim to be willing to listen, to those who are willing to listen neighbors are no longer speaking to neighbors. Will these relations ever be repaired? Kevin?
What a telling question. At Skull Valley Goshutes in Utah, a tiny indigenous nation of 125 adults, and those divisions are still there. Those wounds are still there between the factions on the reservation. So, and it was split right down the middle. That the rumored amount that the nuclear industry was offering to that tiny reservation to take 40,000 metric tons of high-level radioactive waste was between $50 million and $200 million. And this was a very low-income community. The tribal chairman was all for it, and he lined up people, and the money was flowing initially. And you could tell the difference between the pro-dump and the anti-dump residents on the reservation. The pro-dump folks had brand new trucks and brand new homes, and the anti-dump folks did not. And so it was very ugly, deeply divisive. And here we are a dozen years after that dump was blocked, and those wounds are still there. So that's what's so scandalous, is the nuclear industry just picks up its bags and moves on to the next community that it tries to get away with this at, leaving really wounds behind, even though no radioactive waste was ever delivered there.
Great, thanks. And another question for you, Kevin. Are you aware of setbacks required around nuclear dumps elsewhere? We have a concern, the questioner has a concern around the 3 primary schools within just 3 kilometers of the land now owned by NWMO. So Kevin, are you aware of any setbacks in other jurisdictions around nuclear dumps or nuclear waste facilities more generally?
Well, in the US, that's why they target more remote places, I think, than South Bruce. Yucca Mountain, for example, is half on the Nevada nuclear weapons test site and half on Bureau of Land Management land, which is accessible. And then they've created a buffer zone downstream to try to let the radioactivity dilute in the groundwater before it reaches the nearest residents who would drink that water. So that's why they've targeted certain places, is because of their sparse population, but the impacts are still significant. So it's even more alarming to hear that this proposal is in such a populated area.
Okay, thanks. A question, I think we'll put this one maybe to Kevin and then to David, and Kevin can comment if he'd like to add something. So the question is, and this goes to David, how does one go about challenging the myths being told that by the increase in property values remain stable, even though there are citizen concerns about their property values? Maybe that is more a question for you, Kevin. David, if you want to comment first, and then we'll hand it over to Kevin. And then I have another question waiting for Kevin. So David, if you want to comment on that, then Kevin, then a second question for Kevin.
Based on Kevin's excellent presentation and expertise, I would say my answer is ask Kevin.
Well done. Over to you, Kevin. I tried to give you a break there.
Could you repeat it, Renee? I was distracted. I'm sorry.
So how does one go about challenging the myths being told by the industry that property values remain stable, even though there is a citizen concern about their property value? So local residents are concerned about their property value. Industry, i.e. the NWMO in this instance, are saying there is no effect on property values. How can residents respond to that?
It's a real battle for the truth. I'd be happy to share the documents I referenced. Just learn as much as you can and ask questions at every turn and try to shine light on these issues. And the David versus Goliath theme, the other side has so much money and it's usually public money. They have bottomless coffers of public money to work with. And so the propaganda that they put forth is hard to battle against, but it's so necessary to do. But we're always behind the 8 ball on this this battle for the truth.
Bernayne,
Go ahead, David.
can I offer a short answer on the question regarding the division in the community and what can be done?
Certainly, please do.
So really the willing host community promise of your town council is actually a different way of saying that there has to be a social license to bring this facility in. And it shouldn't be just based on a majority. That has to be one component, but also if there is a significant minority that are opposed because they have significant concerns, those should also be addressed. And I think that's important, that this is not a straight up or down vote. This is, you need a majority of the population and you need to satisfy the majority, a minority, if they have legitimate concerns. This shouldn't be the tyranny of the majority. Now, I have something to say about the wind turbine decision. So there's an example of council not conducting a plebiscite, not having a referendum, not doing any kind of rigorous evaluation or consultation in terms of what's the community want. Council said to themselves, we've heard from the community, we think that a majority of the community is against this, and then so they acted immediately and unilaterally to say we're not a willing host community for turbines. Okay, good for you, municipality, that's your criteria for making that sort of decision. Well, is there any doubt in anyone's mind that there isn't a solid majority in this community against this facility? So why is town council not using the same criteria that it did in the turbine instance to tell NWMO that they are not a willing host community? Whatever the criteria was they used for the turbines, if they applied that same criteria now, they'd ask NWMO to get lost. What I see is they've changed the rules because the NWMO is introducing a lot of money into the community. They're trying to warp public opinion, and that after a certain amount of conditioning, then and only then will they do the consultation and at a point when they think is optimal for obtaining what they think is a majority. So I think that this could easily be said to be hypocrisy on the part of the South Bruce Town Council.
Thank you, David. I'm going to send the next question to you as well, David. The questioner poses the question, is the industry actually responsible for the way people react to the project? Isn't that just a convenient cop-out for treating your neighbors like, I'll say, for treating your neighbors poorly? David, do you want to comment on that?
That's a good question, an excellent
Not really
observation.
a legal question, but I'm going to give it to you.
Yes, well, look, I've worked with a lot of First Nations groups, a lot of residents associations. Because of the nature of the business of facility siting, most proposals like smokestacks, garbage dumps, large industrial facilities typically wind up in poor or under-resourced neighborhoods. You don't find garbage dumps, nuclear power plants being proposed in Rosedale in downtown Toronto. That never happens. So I'm sort of used to the process whereby corporations come to town, they have a willing partner with under-resourced municipal governments, and they really push and push and push until they get what they want. I guess the disappointment in this situation is that the only government's really on the stage here, the only government on the stage here is the municipality, and the only authority the municipality has really to stop a proposal is through the Planning Act, and this municipality is ignoring its only jurisdiction or authority to influence, approve, or deny the facility. So you've got a kind of an absence on the part of the federal government, which has really devolved or divested itself of this determining the technical elements of the process and also the willing host community aspect. You got the provincial government that seems to be absent, even though some of their clients are, they're partly responsible for the generation of this stuff. I think this is really a failure on the part of government to actually seize control adopt a proper environmental assessment, and get the right jurisdiction involved, which in my opinion is the federal government. At the end of the day, all those complaints that I just registered are actually all part of a legal opinion that I've provided to the directors of the POW, and they know exactly what to do if this process unfolds the way that it looks like it's going to.
Great. Thank you very much, David. We're coming close to our closing time, friends. We've got about 10 minutes left. We want to reserve a few of those for closing remarks. I'm going to go with one final question, and it's a question for, I'm going to send to Kevin. The question is, you're obviously opposed to any nuclear waste storage. I'll just clarify that we're actually not talking about storage this evening. We're talking about a proposal for a deep geological repository for all of Canada's high-level waste. But I'm going to pose the question to Kevin. You're opposed to deep geological repositories. I will translate. What's your solution? So Kevin, if you could speak to that.
Yes, in the United States, we have a group consensus statement across the environmental movement. It's referred to as hardened on-site storage. It's been signed by over 200 organizations in all 50 states, including, as but one example, Michigan Environmental Council in Michigan, which is itself a group of 75, a coalition of 75 groups. What it calls for is the emptying of the pools, which are vulnerable to catastrophes, into dry cask storage that is designed well, built well, taking into consideration the potential for accidents and attacks, with monitoring for pressure, temperature, radioactivity. A lot of that is not happening in the United States. And as sea levels rise, and we have a lot of nuclear power plants on the sea coasts, but also the lake levels are at historic highs, even hardened on-site storage may not be safe for the long term. So moving it to higher ground, further inland, as an interim measure. Hardened on-site storage is an interim measure. I also have another document that bears my name, and it's entitled Stringent Criteria for Geologic Disposal Repositories. It's about 10 criteria. They include things like legality, because the Western Shoshone have treaty rights at Yucca Mountain, so that proposal is illegal on its face. Environmental justice, technical suitability, mitigating the transportation risks, and the list goes on and on. So I'd be happy to share those two documents. There's the near term, interim storage, which has to stay where it's at, will stay where it's at. And then there's what to do ultimately. And the dilemma is that it can't stay on the surface of the planet forever, because if this stuff leaks out into the biosphere, it will be a catastrophe. It's a dilemma. We need to stop making it.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And thank you. You've been an excellent group. We've had great discussion, good questions, excellent comments and suggestions of documents and more in the chat. I'll leave it to Protect Our Waterways to determine how they're going to deal with that in terms of follow-up, but we do have your email addresses and so on. I'm now going to turn it over to Bill Knoll from Protect Our Waterways South Bruce for some closing remarks. Bill.
Well, thank you, Brendan. First of all, I want to thank those who attended tonight's session. I know your time is very valuable, and our reason for hosting these sessions is really to give the residents another view other than the NWMO and our council of the pros and cons associated with creating a DGR. So that's the purpose of these sessions. We will continue to have more in the future. We are planning the next one for March 17th, and we'll have a speaker from Port Hope there, Faye Moore, to tell us about what her experiences have been with the situation in Port Hope. And we'll also have Teresa McClanahan, who's the executive director of the Canadian Environmental Law Association, at that session. So we're planning that for March 17th. So keep that on your calendars if you would. It's St. Patrick's Day, so it shouldn't be hard to remember. So first of all, I want to thank David for the excellent overview of the process and what the role of the municipality should be in conducting these kinds of undertakings. They're very complex, they're very expensive, and they're very difficult to find a way through the whole process. So having David give us some insights to what some of the legal issues are and how to approach it has been very beneficial to us, and very useful, I think, generally to the whole public, that to get an appreciation that this is, and a lot of us don't have a lot of time to do an in-depth evaluation of all of the studies that are going on and all of the material that you're presented with. So it's good to have the opportunity to kind of narrow down, well, what are the real issues associated with the implementation of a DGR. So thank you, David, for that. Very useful, very insightful. And to Kevin, really, I know you have loads of experience relative to this whole process of nuclear waste. So your insight and your experiences associated with looking at these towns and communities, and it's so nice that you were up in Ontario to get an appreciation for what our environment is like and what the role would be. So thank you for all of those good insights and understanding of some of the issues that are associated with hosting and being a willing host community. And to Brennan, thank you for hosting this. I know your time is very valuable, and to spend the time with us tonight and to help us through this session. Well, I want to thank you very much for doing that. So that's kind of the wrap up. I think it was a great session. I think there was a lot of information shared. We're happy to take those questions and forward them to the people that were presenting at tonight's session and get some answers and get them back to you. As far as the audience is concerned, I see there's about 20 questions. We answered maybe half of those. So we'll look at some of the questions and see whether or not we can get some answers back to the community. So thanks again for being part of the process. And we're hoping that these information sessions will help you to be, as the town likes to say, be more informed and educated about the whole aspects of a DGR. So thanks again. So Brennan, I guess that's the end of our session for tonight. And thank you, David, and thank you, Kevin, for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here as well.